Hello, how's you going? If you've seen any of my recent videos, you may have noticed that I've pretty much just been building the exact same copy and paste building a million times over. So I've decided to get a little bit of a palette cleanser today by doing a creative build, and while I'm doing that, I'm going to also try and refresh some of the skills that I don't use as much, like terraining and texturing. So with that being said, I found this place that I quite like. It's just a little bit of a mountain, and it's got this nice little gap in between two smaller hills on top of it. And I plan to build some sort of a house here. I don't have too much of a plan, but I'm just gonna figure it out as I go. As you can see, there are quite a few little imperfections with the land, so I started off by using a mix of axiom and manual work to try and fix those up. I then used some wool blocks to shape out the build before starting to work on some sort of a gradient for the base of the build. I did also put in a couple of mud bricks around the base of the gradient as well to try and show that there is some sort of like mud piling up onto it. But after I was happy with it, I did actually move on to putting it around the back side of the build. Also, you may have seen me put a couple of arches on the front, and that's just going to have a path running through it underneath the actual upper part of the build. After I finished up putting the walls on the back, I moved over to the front to put in another wall, which is also going to have the door on it, which I tried to put a little bit of an arch on top of as well. I did at first try to use levers to try and create the arch, but it wasn't quite enough, so I had to switch to bricks, but I have seen it work on some builds. Now that I've finished up the base of the build, I moved on to the top where I went through quite a few different iterations of block palettes before I finally decided on one that I liked. The palette I found was a mix of birch, diorite, and stripped pale. And of course, now that I've found something I like, my game decides to crash, so after one quick reboot, I started putting that pattern around the rest of the walls. Or at least I was until I got distracted building a path. It doesn't exactly go anywhere, but it does look pretty, and also while I was at it, I did fix up a little bit of the ground around as well. Also, before I went back to building, I did put a little bit of a coarse dirt lining around the build. I don't know what it's for, but it is there. I put this little bit of an out jutting off of the side of one of the walls, and I'm still trying to figure out what I'm going to use it for at this point, but you'll see what it is for later. Also, you may have seen on the out jutting, I'm doing kind of an odd roof shape. It kind of starts off flatter and then goes up to a point with like a bit of a curve. I don't really know why I did that. I was just kind of bored of building regular roofs. Before I moved on, I did also put those roofs onto the front before moving on to the second layer where I almost immediately crashed. And then I started putting the walls around the rest of it and then crashed again, so that's just great. Although when I was building the front wall, it is kind of strange because it's got kind of a bit of a angle going onto it, and you'll see later, but that makes the roof really difficult to build. And speaking of roofs, I built the roof on the right side of the build before going on to building the big main roof, where I had quite a lot of trouble, you'll see. I started off by making it go up on like kind of a diagonal, and then that just looked really strange, so I tried to make it go straight, and I went through a couple of different iterations of doing this before I finally decided on something that I liked. I then put some extra little details on the build, like putting some fences in the corners and some signs lining the bottoms, and then I also put the walls underneath the roofs. So a bit of a midway check-in here, and I wish I actually recorded this in person so I don't have to use replay and voiceover, but we work with what we got. So far, this build is actually turning out to be a little bit more difficult than I thought it was going to be, mainly just because I didn't really think it out when I was building those original template shapes, and that diagonal wall caused me a lot of trouble. Like, it went by 3 seconds in the recording, and I just checked, but it was actually 30 minutes of me just trying to figure that out. But enough sooking, I do actually like the shape of the build, and I think I've come up with a few decent textures, like especially with that bottom and the top. I don't know, I think they just work pretty well together, and especially with that little spruce lining that it has between it. As you've seen, I did also try to spice it up a little bit by adding a little bit of an out jutting, but I did kind of leave the back wall blank, so I might have to try and figure something out for that later. But at the moment, I'm very happy with where it's at, so let's move on to the interior. Starting off on the bottom floor here, I flattened out the ground, getting rid of a little bit of a mound of dirt that was in there before I put in some walls which were made of stripped jungle. For the floor, I did a random mix of stone bricks, and polished andesite, which is kind of just a strange looking pattern, but it works. And then moving on to the top floor, I did a bit of an alternating pattern with stripped birch. It was kind of a bit weird the way I did it. I made a couple of lines of it, and then I tried to use the smear tool in Axiom, but it didn't really work, so I ended up pulling out the debug stick to rotate them all. I'm pretty sure everyone knows how to do this floor, because it's probably one of the most common floors in Minecraft, but it's pretty much just alternating any stripped log, and it makes this weird weaving pattern. When I went back down to the bottom floor, it looked kind of strange, so I lined the roof with some spruce and then built a staircase going up to the next floor. Pretty much every time when I build a staircase, I put some trapdoors along the side of it in this weird alternating pattern, and it kind of looks like railings in a way. Moving back up to the top floor, I started lining the walls with stripped jungle again, making sure to leave gaps for the windows. That extra block of depth that you get on the windowsills doesn't seem like it would give you that much, but it actually allows for a lot of detail, as you can add a little bit of a window liner. Normally I do this with beehives as well, and I put like a little bit of a on top of it as well. As with every floor, when I moved up to the last floor, I lined all the walls with stripped jungle, and I'm still struggling to say that, of course. When I put the roof in, it was also spruce, and I didn't like how much spruce was in there, so I went to go and change the roof to dark oak, but I figured that the floor would look better as dark oak instead. Also, just a side note here, but I've been using Axiom this entire build, and oh my god, it is such a good tool. Like, when I'm switching the blocks just easy like that, that's what I'm using, and it is so good. After building the stairs going up to the 3rd floor, I remembered that there was that outjutting there, and I decided to make it a little bit of a fireplace, and I even put a chimney on the outside as well. I initially put the chimney just coming straight out of the roof, but I decided to actually attach it to the wall and make it pretty much the entire wall just cobblestone. Moving back onto the interior, I started off on the bottom floor by putting in a little bit of a storage area, and I can't go anywhere in this build without a game crash, so of course that happened. I then built a little bit of a workstation, some sort of a furnace array as well with a shelf on front, and then I moved back over to the storage where I dumped a bunch of barrels around. To finish up the floor, I put 2 little plants on either side of the door, and then underneath the stairs I just dumped a bunch of barrels around. Moving on to the next floor, I put another wall in, splitting it into 3 separate rooms, and messed around with a bunch of doors for a while before turning around and building some sort of a basic kitchen. To go with the kitchen, I built a big dining table with some chairs that had banners on them to kind of look like cushioned chairs or something along those lines. Moving over to the fireplace, I put down 2 plants and a couple of paintings, as well as a little bit of a shelf with some ornaments on it. Over at the stairs, I put down a painting and a shelf with some plants on it, and then I moved on to building some sort of a carpet out of coral. I've seen it been done a couple of times, but I just wanted to try it. I added another painting to the stairwell, and then ended up removing the first one I put down to put a window in instead. Heading into the first room on this floor, I started off by placing down a double bed with some sort of a weird painting on top of it. I then put in a really tall bookshelf before moving on to the second room, which was almost exactly the same. Other than the obvious difference of the room being bigger, I also put in a shelf and a painting in this room as well. Moving on to the third and final floor in this building, I decided to split it into 2, filling the first room with a couple of paintings, a clock, and an armor stand. I also tried something a little bit different with some plants in this room by having some vines hanging off of them to try and make like a drooping effect. After adding a window, I moved on to the next room where I started off with a really grand bed design before turning around and adding some sort of a weird bush. To finish filling the room, I added a cabinet, a couple of shelves, and a wardrobe before finishing up the bushes with a couple of resin clumps to try and make some sort of flowers. Now moving back to the outside of the build, I added a few things like a window trim and changed a couple of things as well, like that little strip of wood under the roofs. I then extended the paths and started working on the terrain. Similar to the other path, I didn't actually lead it to anywhere, but it's implied that it does go somewhere, so maybe later on down the track I might build somewhere that it goes to. With the terrain, I started off by getting rid of the naturally generated grass and then using Axiom to smooth out the area. I then filled in a big crater that was to the left of the house and smoothed out the hill that it was on. Moving back over to the main bit of the terrain, I started manually putting in moss and concrete powder, forgetting that Axiom actually has a tool for this exact purpose. But essentially what I did is I just replaced most of the grass with moss in kind of a loopy pattern and then added some splotches of green concrete powder. I know it looks horrible now, but you just gotta trust me. Once I add the grass, tall grass, ferns, and tall ferns, it does come together. As well as that, I did also put in some acacia saplings with string on top of it, some bushes, and some rocks, which really helped to tie it together. As I said, it did look pretty bad at the start, but now that all the grass is covering it, it does look significantly better. At this point, I remembered the tool that I was talking about earlier and started covering the entire place with that texture. With that process done, I pretty quickly covered it with the grass and ferns and whatnot. And also, I know I'm showing the back right now, but you're just gonna have to ignore it because I know it looks absolutely terrible. I mean, I tried to make it look better. You can see I put that little bit of a detail on the bottom there, and I don't know, it just doesn't look that good. Moving on now though, I did actually see that it was kind of blank on either side of the house, so I tried putting in some trees. But I haven't actually really made any trees before, so this was kind of my first attempt. So it started off looking pretty shocking, but by the time that I was finished with it, it actually looked pretty good. And this took like 30 minutes, so I'm just gonna let it sit here for a little bit so you can see my process. Before moving on to the second tree, I tried to add a little bit of shadow around the house by adding in some bone blocks, but I don't really know how it went. It kinda looks good, but it also doesn't. Now this second tree, in my opinion, ended out turning a lot better, and I did actually spend a whole lot more time shaping out the branches before covering it with leaves, so that might have been the thing that helped. But I don't know, I'm a little bit biased, so I'll let you decide which one is actually better in the comments. I did also add 2 smaller trees as well, with one of them being pretty good and then the other one's a little bit iffy as I tried using fences to make a skinnier trunk. Although that being said, it does actually finish the view, and with that the build is done. Alright, so what do you think? I mean, I spent quite a long time on it, but it's nothing overly too special. That being said, I did actually put a whole lot of effort in it, so I would like a little bit of criticism, or like constructive criticism, by the way. Don't just go saying stuff in the comment section. I don't know, especially with these trees. This is my first time building trees, as I said, so I don't know, it would be nice to get some feedback. I know that there's definitely a lot that can be improved on them, but I don't think they're overly too bad. Like, I mean, like, if we just ignore this one, of course, but I don't know, they're not too bad. One thing I did notice though, this one does kind of look like somebody just grabbed it and snapped it, so I do need to work on not doing that. As for the actual build itself, if we just ignore the back, it is actually pretty good, honestly. I mean, I like this little arch thing that I did on the front. One thing I might actually fix up is I might move these over by a block, because I noticed that when in the replays, and I don't actually really like it, so I'm just going to quickly do that. I mean, yeah, that just looks so much better. I didn't put it on the other side, but that's just because of the way that this wall is sitting. But let's move on now. I mean, the interior, I guess, it is actually pretty good in my opinion. I do quite like it. I did try to make it, like, if you were to build this in survival, you can actually live through it. So I did put a decent amount of storage. I tried to put in all the tables that you would actually use, and plenty of furnaces as well. Probably my favorite is this area in here. I don't know, I just really like it. But overall, just the entire place in general, the interior is really good. I definitely like the double layered walls. I should probably try and do that more often. The only room I'm not overly too fond of is this room in here. Like, it's not bad, but it's just kind of basic and nothing really in it either. And kind of same said with this room, but I do like this bed design. The only thing I would improve is maybe try and make this look a little bit less thin. But other than that, it's a pretty decent interior. Moving back outside, I just want to take a quick look at this terrain. I mean, in the time lapse, you can see that it actually looked pretty shoddy. I mean, if I go up here, you can kind of see it. It looks pretty strange without all the grass on it, but once you get the grass covering it back up, that little undertone of the lighter greens is actually a pretty good little detail. I mean, you can kind of see over here where it doesn't have the grass on it, what it looks like without it, and it looks kind of, I don't know, it just kind of doesn't really look that good. But I don't know, I'm pretty happy with the way that it turned out as a whole. I mean, I'm actually pretty proud of the way that I made this roof come out with this odd angle, and it looks terrible from the back, but we don't look at the back. So anyway, let me just get to my favorite viewing position, and I don't know, it looks pretty good. But anyway, this is all the time that I have for today, so if you didn't like the video, please do consider liking and commenting to tell me what you liked about it as well. But anyway, now that I've had my palette cleansed, I'm going to go back to building in the survival world, and I do actually have quite a few good ideas, so look out for that video next week. See you next time.